welcome to Maverick Minded Realtors. We're here to talk about what everyone is talking about, and that is the NAR ruling, the changes that are coming to effect August of 2024 this year. And we are actually here to take a little bit of a different angle. We want to talk about the can of worms and all the questions and all the effects it's going to have not only on the industry, but buyers and sellers, realtor concerns, and the ethical issues that it poses. Because I know as a realtor, I have asked my broker a lot of questions. And to me, it's like a can of worms of gray area and things that we think are going to have to change. So we'd like to bring that to your attention. We'd love your input, all your questions, things you've thought about, insight below. And let's start the conversation.
Well, let's just talk about like the two rulings that are going to affect everybody the most. One is the buyer's agent compensation. So the buyer's agent compensation is no longer going to be displayed. It's on the MLS, period, end of story. They cannot put it on the MLS. You can put it on your own website or anything not related to the MLS, but you cannot expose it that way. So now you're going to have to call the selling agent to find out if the seller's offering anything. So buyer's agent compensation has to be negotiated. Then the other thing that NAR has made explicitly clear, and about the only two things, is that we have to, as buyer's agents, we now have to sign an agreement, which a lot of people have already been doing in Texas and not so much in other states from what I understand, but you have to sign a buyer's agreement, and that buyer's agreement will explicitly state what your fee is. So that's now something you have to have a discussion, conversation, and come to an agreement about what your fee is going to be, whether they're paying it or you're trying to negotiate it from the seller. So those are the two things that are going to affect everything.
And so our can of worms will begin with that.
Yeah.
Because that poses a million questions for me as a realtor already. So some of the concerns that I know that I would have is now that you have to specify how much you're making in your buyer's rep agreement, there's a lot of things that happen here. Your skills of negotiating as a realtor are going to have to be a little bit different now. Before we could say, hey, there's not a big cost to you. The seller pays it, or the listing agent offers a percentage. To me, it's covered. You can't do that anymore.
You've got to be able to articulate. You're going to have to be able to have that conversation.
And sell your value.
Yeah.
But the question I would have here is, if you're signing a buyer rep agreement prior to knowing what a selling agent or seller is offering as compensation, and you know the type of loan that they maybe have, or you know the affordability that buyer has, that means you have to do a lot more due diligence on what you're showing up front. And so that extra work is coming into play for a buyer's agent. And I feel like they're going to be navigating a little blind. If our job is to serve our client as best as possible, and we know that they can only afford certain things, the question, an ethical question kind of comes up, as if I'm asking a listing agent how much you're offering on a property, then if me not showing that property, is it now still ethical because I know that my buyer, for example, is on a VA loan and they can't pay any part of the commission? And that buyer rep agreement, to clarify, you can't be vague. It has to be very specific. You can't just say whatever they offer, and it has to be agreed upon, and you cannot make any more or any less. So even if you were to lowball in your agreement and they're offering more, you can't actually take the extra compensation.
Yes.
And so my question here is, how are buyer agents really going to vet things ethically, but be able to also have the fiduciary duty to their buyers when they know what they can afford and not afford, with the added layer of the commissions?
So that's the tricky part. So I think that's one of the biggest concerns for everybody, to be clear. You know, I'm sure everybody that watches this feels the same way. And I think that as far as the transparency and negotiation, if you find out like we talked about previously, if you find out that the seller's offering nothing and your buyer cannot afford to pay you, they can't afford the 2% or the 3%, whatever you've negotiated with them, and the seller's offering nothing, well, before, ethically, you were not allowed to steer clients either way, depending on what the seller was willing to offer. If that's what your buyer wanted to see, that's what you showed them. That's the way it was supposed to work. Now, if you're not offering anything to the buyer's agent, there is no ethical responsibility to show that home.
Right, because you're working for no compensation. I
And
mean,
you can't be forced to do that.
right.
So that's where this starts getting
Our
tricky.
first
And
word has
then,
arrived.
yeah, right, here it comes. And so what if it's only 5.5%, a half a
Mhm.
percent, or it's a 1%, and it still doesn't quite get you there? Like, what are you ethically bound to do? So I do feel like the code of ethics for realtors is going to have to get revised as well, because
Mhm.
there's no way you can implement this and not change that.
Right. I mean, I don't really see a way around it. I used to be of the belief that you could just say, and well, let me just say this. I think it's also going to affect buyers and their education of the agent they choose, because if you are a buyer's agent with a brokerage that has higher splits or I can't say requires, but they would typically maybe have higher fees, and you have to make a certain amount in order to make money, right?
Yeah.
Because your brokerage take, that's just something we all deal with. Well, now, as a buyer, if you're choosing an agent, you might be a little bit more aware of what brokerage they're with, and do they require splits, and do they have higher expenses in representing you because they just might
Can
not be
they
able to afford it.
negotiate on
Right.
their own percentages to
And
help you out?
and I would
Can they?
imagine, as a buyer, if I knew I was with an agent where their brokerage took 30%, I might be less hesitant to work with them because they're going to be pushing for a higher compensation that maybe I can't afford based on the type of loan I'm getting, or I have to bring more money to the table in order to make up for that on the down payment of some sort. So there's a lot of variation there where I think buyers are going to have to become a lot more educated on who they're working with and what kind of fees and whatnot they do, and that kind of goes into the world of, yes, they've always been negotiable,
Always.
always. But I think the way that brokerages have developed in the last couple of decades all have very similar structures. And so we are limited in the cost that we have to pay to run our business as realtors. And so I think all of that is going to have to be reconsidered or negotiated, because there are flat fee brokerages like I'm with, that make it a lot easier for me to negotiate my commissions and take less if I want to, or I think it's warranted, or, whatever the reason is that I would do that. Doesn't necessarily mean I'm giving less of a service. It just affords me more flexibility than a realtor that has to give 30% to their brokerage.
Absolutely. It's definitely going to be something that buyers are getting more and more educated with,
Hmm.
because they're going to have that conversation. This is a conversation you've never had to have with your buyers before.
Right.
Typically,
Yeah.
I mean, if you've been in this business long enough, then you are trying to be as transparent and articulate your value as much as possible. But now you're going to have to sit them down and go, okay, if they don't pay me, you will.
Hmm.
And that's the only way we can do this. That's the only way you can see a house. And it's not just what I'm requiring, it's what everybody's
Right.
requiring.
I'd be super interested to see how hesitant buyers are to sign. Now, some buyers are very hesitant to sign those buyer rep agreements anyway. Maybe they're not committed to a realtor, or maybe they're just not really sure what they're doing and they don't want to be locked in. I know sometimes they do buyer rep agreements just for one showing, or maybe a
Yeah,
certain period of time, which you
yeah,
can do,
yeah,
but
you
you
can
can
do.
also, I imagine, amend it. So maybe as you go and you find something, I don't see any rules that say you can't amend your buyer agreement after the fact,
Yeah. So it could
possibly
be
knowing.
for 24 hours, 48 hours, you're in town looking for that. And I don't know if this is the person I'm going to work with, but now,
Yeah.
okay, I decided, yeah, I like you. You're informative. You seem to know what you're doing. I like what you do. I'm going to go ahead and extend that.
Right. So I
Yeah.
think that might be the workaround
Yeah.
in the future.
I definitely think that's something that's going to come into play, which again is another layer of complexity and
Mhm.
more negotiation and paperwork
And
that we're all
skill.
going to have to do. So,
My question as well, kind of piggybacking off of this, is okay, I mainly do listings as a realtor, just for context.
yeah,
So if a lot of chatter has been going around about, well, with these new rules, maybe the buyer is going to forego the buyer's agent because they don't want to be locked in, and they might just contact the listing agent directly to see. My question is, with this new law about having to have a buyer rep agreement, am I required to get a list or a rep agreement signed with that buyer as a listing agent to even show them my property?
so the way it's been communicated to me, I've been sitting in on a lot of national conversations with other brokers to try to figure out, because this has basically been put out there with not a lot of structure, right?
Hmm.
And so we're just trying to figure it out. The brokers are trying to figure it out. The attorneys are trying to figure it out. So The way it's been articulated to me is that, yes, as a listing agent, to show that home, for even for somebody to come into an open house, they have to either have representation that they can state, or they have to sign something that says, I represent you for this house.
That's so wild.
And most states do not allow dual agency, and a lot of states do not allow for intermediary, which is what we allow in Texas. We don't allow dual agency. So there is some nuances there. We'll do another episode on the differences.
Yeah, well,
but
you can
that's a
Google the
whole,
differences.
yeah, you can Google that.
That's
but,
another can of worms.
Yeah. But that being said, then now there's that to deal with. So it creates a big barrier of entry for buyers to just go out for look-sees, unless all you're doing is looking at builders. Because builders, they go by a different set of rules.
By their own rules.
Yeah.
And so to me, that also opens up another line of questions where it comes to, will this increase the use of buyer's agents or not? Because if you are required to have that kind of representation to even see a house, maybe the buyer's agents aren't going to go obsolete, because a lot of chatter out there is there's not going to be much use for them, or maybe listing agents will get more commission because they're the ones showing the houses. But if there's these extra layers and states aren't allowing that, maybe the buyer's agents are actually going to remain essential because they have to have.
Well, as a listing agent, I can state that how many times have you gotten, hey, can you show me this house? And it's a one-off and they don't want to see anything else. And it's 45 minutes away from me.
Yeah.
Do I want to show that house? Probably not. It's 45 minutes away. It's like, don't you have representation? Don't you have somebody that can show you that one house? I mean, maybe if I'm in the neighborhood, but for the most part, I don't want to kill my Saturday going an hour away to show you one house that you're probably not going to buy.
To which everyone would say, okay, lazy realtor.
No, I've got stuff to do. I do other stuff.
I do understand
But
it's a time cost thing. And as a realtor, you do a lot of things. You wear a lot of hats and you're on the road a lot. And so it's just not always feasible for you to be able to get to do that. Because my question was, I wonder if we're going to see a lot more buyers use attorneys to close instead of buyer's agents, because you can do that in Texas. We're a dual state, and their fees could end up being a lot cheaper than having to pay a commission as a percentage of a market value of a house.
However, they cannot show you the house.
They can't show you. And so if these buyer reps are still part of the negotiation, and if the listing agent is still making a commission, on their side, but I mean, it will be interesting to see if we go that route. Maybe if they sort out this whole agreement, that might be an option where they're not going to buyer's agents, but they're going to attorneys. Just a thought.
It's a possibility. I see that more with like investors, though. Because investors already do that to a certain degree. So
that is true. And there are a lot of attorneys at title companies as well. Now, not all title companies have attorneys on staff or with them, because Texas is one of those states where you can be either or. But I feel like a lot of them do anyway. So it might be worthwhile to even just ask the attorneys at your title companies how they would handle certain things. But the commissions are still up in the air.
Yeah,
I would say for the most part. So let's talk a little bit more on how it's going to impact
the buyers
and the sellers. We touched a little bit on my question about the buyers. How do you think it's going to affect the sellers?
So the sellers, I've had a lot of phone calls from a lot of different sellers or people going, oh, I think I'll just wait. It'll save me money. And I tell every seller, look, you don't want to, I understand the frame of mind and there's a lot of chatter out there. However, in order to sell your home, you still need people to come and see it. So in order for people to come and see it, it is best if we still offer something. Maybe it's not what typically you would have offered a year ago. Maybe it's a little bit less, but you definitely want to offer something, because buyers, it's going to be so much more expensive for buyers at this point. Now you've got not only down payment, but you've got closing costs, and now you also have to pay for the commissions. So it's going to eliminate a lot of buyers if the sellers just absolutely stop doing that.
Right.
So I tell all my sellers that you really don't want to do that completely.
Right. And I would agree with that. And I personally have always been somebody who, when I first got started, I discounted my commissions as a new realtor. I felt it was justified. I'm new. I don't have as much experience. It was the way that I got my foot in the door, built business in a network. And then I ended up working with investors who are pretty knowledgeable. I don't have to hold their hand as much. And so I have never switched my commission structure. And it's been great and a super cool way to build my business. But one thing that I think is interesting, and I agree with you on still offering those commissions on it, but I think in regards to how a seller, what's the right word I'm looking for? I think that they want some skin in the game too, because I have done some research on different sales positions and commission structures. And I do feel that real estate with values exponentially increasing over time, always, that's just how it works.
Yeah.
It's one of the best investments. If you're at a fixed percentage and that value is going off, your work might change or stay the same with technological changes and things. But at the end of the day, the question is that 3% on an increasing asset has been fixed for so long and it's getting more and more and more. So my question would be to everybody is maybe we readjust, like, what is the value of a realtor in percentage of the, like, I feel like it's one of the only sales positions with such a high, like, commission on such a high priced item. So I always ask the question of, like, am I being overly compensated for my job? I know this is not common and most sellers are fighting for their value. And I think there's huge value, but I'm also realistic. And I think a lot of your sales pitches, I'll give you an example. I had a seller recently who was very concerned about my lower commission.
Mhm.
I took 2% instead of 3. She didn't have a lot of room. She needed to make a certain amount. It was all she was retiring on. I felt comfortable with it. I felt it was worth it. She was paying for the cleanouts. Long story short,
Yeah.
I thought it was fair.
Yeah.
She was so concerned. Are you making enough money? Are you doing enough? Now that's unique. Okay. Most sellers are trying to discount it.
Yeah. No, it's or can we get it any lower?
Right.
Yeah.
And so I bring that up as an example just to say that I do think that there is a value cutoff where it's like, okay, well, what if my house was 200,000? Would you still put the amount of effort in at a certain percentage? And maybe at a higher price point, you might take a lower because the percentage is so wild.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of chatter out there about how the realtor commission structure for the asset is the most disproportionate sales compensation of any industry.
You could take that stance, but also there are a lot of industries out there. There's a very few industries out there that are where you're considered a professional. People,
That's true.
life-changing, life-altering investments that you sit here and negotiate with your
Yeah,
surgeon
that's a fair
or
point.
your, lawyer or whatever. Their fees are their fees are their fees.
Right.
Period.
Fair.
And they go up with the cost of living.
Yeah.
Which is kind of how ours goes up. Yes, it goes up with the percentage how everything appreciates, but so does the cost of living go up as well.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I
Fair
get
point.
what you're
Very
saying.
fair point. I'm
but
throwing it out there because it is a conversation
Yeah.
that's been happening. It's like,
Yeah.
well, what is fair, what's not? Now, every situation is different, and I think that it's the reason commissions have always been negotiable is obviously for anti-trade and
antitrust. Yeah.
laws that were passed a long time ago, and the reason that existed. And I think we've lost sight that they have always been negotiable. And I think that we've just gotten so acceptable when you get into the industry expecting that. Maybe this is one of those industries that's going to shift where you can't expect that. So when running your numbers about whether this is a good career choice for you or not, just something to consider.
Well, and now more than ever, like I just feel like the ability to communicate is going to
Yeah.
become like
Huge.
so exponentially more important than it's ever been before. Like it's always been important. We're dealing with like some pretty big assets here.
Mm-hmm.
It's always been important, but now you really are going to be you have to be able to articulate that value.
And in order to communicate and articulate well, you need to know your stuff. And
Yeah.
that would bring me to the whole rulings that came out for the loans and the lenders. So if you are dealing with a buyer who's on a VA loan, an FHA, or a conventional, they just came out with verdicts at the time being about what a buyer can pay or not pay. So for those of you that don't know, for a VA loan for a veteran, they cannot put any money towards commissions inside the transaction or outside the transaction. Completely forbidden. That means that if you get a buyer who has a VA loan, they will not be able to make any compensation.
So that seller has to be able to pay you,
Yes.
period.
Which means you can only show them houses or get houses that are offering that compensation to you. So that's something that you're going to have to know is what is the type of loan your buyer's getting. So FHA came out and said they can,
They can,
but you cannot put it, what was the language they used? It can't be part of the mortgage. You can't wrap it into the mortgage. So it can't be like an additional cost that wraps into the loan that you're getting. It has to be separate, which means FHA buyers are naturally going to have to bring a lot more money to the table.
Yeah, I mean, basically, they're paying for it out of pocket.
Right.
It's nothing new. Basically, they're paying for it out of pocket. These loans are set up to say that no, we don't pay for commissions. This is something that we touched on before when we
Hmm.
mentioned NAR in a previous episode, but it's technically it is wrapped up in the loan. As it is now and as it always has been, it's been wrapped up in the loan. So that also lean leads me to believe that probably we're going to see some reworking of different loan programs that are going
Hmm.
to include this, because
Yeah.
otherwise it's just making the barrier of entry for buyers, especially lower income buyers, first time home buyers, that whole middle income buyers. You have to come so much out of pocket to get a house. Once this passes, that it's they're going to have to make some changes.
I agree with you
Yeah.
100%. Even though, I mean, FHA obviously has to put, I mean, they don't have to put as much down as a conventional.
Yep.
Conventional, I don't see any problems with it. They have a lot more freedom with regards to how they can wrap it in. But it'll be interesting to see how it's going to get paid.
Yep.
I don't really see how they're going to be able to swing it. So I don't know. Maybe it isn't the end of the world here. Maybe not a lot of change is actually going to happen.
Maybe the sky isn't falling.
Might not be falling. It might be, might not. So yeah, I think we kind of touched on all the different parties that it could affect, and I don't know if a lot of people are having that conversation. I've heard a lot from realtors, but I haven't. I don't know how educated the sellers and buyers are on this shift and in hiring a professional, the questions that they need to ask. So I think that if you're a realtor out there and you want to market to sellers and buyers, this would be a good conversation topic for you. If you wanted to market to them, help them navigate these waters, that's going to give you value and help you get more business regardless. And then just be knowledgeable and help communicate to your clients that you know what's going on, that you can help structure it for them. And I just think it's going to take an extra layer of knowledge on the lending side and watching that market and seeing how those rules change. Because I think it is all up in the air.
It's definitely all up in the air, and it will be about communication. We have put together recently for our brokerages that there is certain buyer documentation that we walk people through, kind of like a listing presentation,
Hmm.
but it's for a buyer. So now you're treating that buyer just like you would a listing of, look, this is what I'm going to provide, and this is what my fee will be to do that.
Yeah. Definitely. I think that's a lot of stuff to think about. If you guys think of anything else, please put it below. Things we haven't thought of, maybe theories about what might shift if you're a professional in the lending world or in title or anything like that, and we'd love your insight. I want to leave us on a cliffhanger
Yeah.
because one thing we didn't mention
Yeah.
was the role of NAR. So the
Oh,
National
yeah.
Association of Realtors came in, negotiated a settlement, and some MLS boards are actually rejecting the rule changes. Washington was one of them. I know a small board in Washington. So it'll be interesting to see. We'll probably do an episode on that. But to get your brain turning, the role of NAR, how it represents you, what they do, and if MLS boards are going to break free from them or not.
Yeah. Like what's going to happen?
Not really sure.
Not really sure, but
So
we can have that conversation.
keep an eye out for that episode coming up soon. We'd love to hear from you. And thank you so much for joining us.
Be sure to subscribe, like, and follow, and we look forward to seeing you next time.